They might be some meals. They've got glasses. Oh, okay. Worst case scenario, you could probably leave your glasses next to that. I'll just do that now. Good thinking.
Yeah, no, they're using it, so you just won't be. That's right.
Hello, everyone. Is that a little too loud? I think we'll go ahead and ask our panelists to take their seat and we'll get started. Good morning. My name is Sherry Street and I'm with the Illinois Policy Institute. So on behalf of the Institute and ACLU Illinois, I am delighted to welcome all of you in this room and to our friends watching on YouTube to Winning the Fight for Fairness, a discussion on criminal justice reform in Illinois. I'd also like to thank our esteemed panelists, whom you'll meet here shortly, for participating today. And I'd also like to thank the MacArthur Foundation for their longstanding vision for a fairer justice system in America and for their generous support of reform efforts here in Illinois, including this forum, through their Safety and Justice Challenge. Our work would not be possible without their leadership and support, so we can't thank you enough. You know, it's hard to believe that nearly 3 years ago, we gathered for a very similar forum with our friends from Right on Crime and Illinois, ACLU. Ben, I believe you were on that panel as well. At that time, the Illinois Policy Institute was the new kid on the block. We realized not only was this work the right thing to do, but for our quest to restore hope in Illinois as a place where all of its residents were able to achieve their dreams, raise their families, and flourish would not be attained without reforming our criminal justice system. So we started out by talking to many folks, many of you here in this room, that have been fighting this fight for a long time to reform our system. We shared how we thought we could add value, and we asked lots of questions. We also talked to people who had had brushes with the system to get their perspective on what needed to change. And their powerful stories moved us and have shaped our reform efforts ever since. People like Lisa Creason. As a young mother, desperate to provide for her children, Lisa committed a crime, after which she made a promise to her kids that she would turn her life around, go to nursing school, and become a registered nurse to provide them the kind of life that they deserved. Well, Lisa kept her promise to her children, but her dream was soon crushed upon learning she couldn't be licensed in Illinois because of a lifetime ban for people with felony records. But to her credit, she did not give up. She began her own advocacy campaign and to change the law. And we joined with Lisa in her fight, and last year she was present when the governor signed her bill into law. And today I am happy to report that Lisa is a licensed registered nurse and living happily her dream. Thanks to the determination of Illinois' Criminal Justice Coalition, other occupational licensing bans have been lifted, record sealing and expungement for juveniles was expanded, and standards for civil asset forfeiture have been reformed. This is a real testament to the power of this coalition. As you may remember, most of these changes occurred during the 2-year impasse in Springfield, so that makes it all the more remarkable. That said, as you know, there is still much more work to be done, but I'll leave that to our panelists to discuss. So again, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us, and your continued support. We can advance the cause of fairness in our justice system here in Illinois. So with that, I would like to introduce or invite our moderator, Hillary Gowans, to the podium. Hillary is an award-winning journalist and Vice President of Communications at Illinois Policy Institute, and my dear friend. Hillary, help me welcome Hillary.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. Like Sherry said, we're really excited to have you all here joining us to have this conversation. So we're going to talk about what's happened in the past few years, where we are today, and where we need to go in the future. And we're really excited to be joined by our esteemed panel here today. We've got voices from a lot of different groups. We've got guests from Texas. Welcome. So let me introduce you to our panelists right now. We've got at the end of the table here John Mackey. John is the Executive Director of the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. Next to John, we've got Derek Cohen. He is the Deputy Director for the Right on Crime campaign at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. David Kamick is Senior Fellow at the Illinois Policy Institute and is a criminal defense attorney based in Kane County. You're looking at me funny.
No.
All right. And then next to David, we've got Ben Riddell, who I've just learned has a new title. He's Director of Criminal Justice Policy at the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois. So panelists, welcome and thank you. So I had the pleasure of getting to talk to these folks ahead of all of you, but I want to open up the discussion today with a question addressed to the whole panel. And that question is, what is the purpose or goal of our criminal justice system? Derek, I know you had some thoughts.
I'll jump in. Well, I think maybe a good place to start, you mentioned the MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge earlier, and those two words, safety and justice, kind of, if we're going to come up with a shorthand of what the purpose of the system is to achieve those two things, to give, to make the public safe, and to give society a sense that justice has been done when people transgress, that there's an appropriate response that makes us feel like our system of laws works. So what that means to different people, takes a lot of different forms, but I think those are the two objectives that almost everybody can agree we want out of the system.
Well, I'd say I would quibble a little bit with Ben on that, simply that I don't think justice really properly conceptualized is something that we can measure, and therefore, how do we actually enact policies that quote unquote achieve it? I mean, it's an abstract philosophical concept. I think public safety is a little bit more operational, insofar as we can create a system that says we have X number of this particular crime, and hopefully we have a delta in that number that goes downward. Is that success? Well, it could be partial success, but if there was no justice in that abstract concept being done as well, is that successful? And so I think it's more of when we look at the criminal justice system, the way we kind of project our values upon it, it manifests itself in different ways. The academic in me wants to go back to the 5 purposes of criminal justice, the deterrence, retribution, incapacitation, restoration, and rehabilitation. Now, those all have distinct term of art meanings, but how do we actually operationalize them? And I don't think we've actually made that determination as a society yet. And that's where the conversation should be happening is, if we're going to rehabilitate people, how do we measure it, and what does rehabilitation look like? I said earlier today when we were having this conversation that the only thing that we really do well with prisons is incapacitate. And when I say incapacitate, I don't even mean keep people from offending again, but keep people from offending against folks on the outside. And even we're not perfect at that, but that's something that's at least measurable and objective. And so until we litigate the rest of it, I really don't know how to answer the question what the criminal justice system is for.
I usually jump right in, but David, you want to? I kind of like actually waiting back and kind of, there's a lot to think about right now.
You've exposed my plan.
Okay.
But I think that the simple answer, the right answer, is if government has one job, is to keep us safe. Everything after that the government does is a bonus, but it's to keep us safe. That's what government is supposed to do, keep us safe nationally from threats on the outside and keep us safe locally from threats on the inside. If we say that's the first job, and then the next step is, okay, how do we keep us safe? That's where it gets complex, because we can't, as a society, agree on what's safe, what isn't, what should be a crime, what isn't a crime. And as we've all said before, when the legislature's in session and reacting to something, none of us is safe.
That's very true. I mean, I think, I guess one thing I would say, I think this is an important question to leave open as a question, especially when it leans philosophical around what is justice. I mean, that it's, you know, the question of justice is one of the founding questions of philosophy. And if you read into those classic texts, you'll figure out that there's various theories, but there's no real finality to that work. And I think that's part of, when we think about the question of justice, we're also thinking about what kind of people we want to be. It's an aspirational question. And I think it's unfortunate in our society that we have a very simplistic notion of what criminal justice is and what it should do. But I 100% agree with Derek that while I think tend to think that way, and there's various words I've used in the past, for example, when I do advocacy type work, like, oh, this isn't rocket science, or it's simple. And the reality is, you know, we have rocket science. I don't know if we have a true science of criminal justice. I mean, we certainly have scientific endeavors and all that. I don't mean to say there's no science behind some of the work we do, but there is no kind of, we have rockets that can fly, and I don't know if we have a criminal justice system that can work. And I don't know other parts of government as well as I know the criminal justice system, but I think I would hazard a guess, although I'd be happy to be corrected here, that I think it's one of the few systems, if not the only system, that has no clear purpose. I don't know it's a system, I mean, typically, and say for example, like prisons, like, I think everyone, you know, we tend to measure prisons on terms of people who come back and how high that rate is, but I don't know if we know what the correct rate would be. I don't know what we know, like, what would it mean for a prison to fail? And I think that's true in general for the criminal justice system. I think we have pretty impossible expectations of what we want from these systems and the people who work in them. And very rarely do we ask, well, are those realizable goals? Are they the right goals? You know, can these systems do these things? And so we're kind of caught in this discourse that's very much up here and all around us, but very, very rarely is it actually focused on the operations of these systems, which I think are on some level super complicated, but also pretty concrete. I mean, prisons can incapacitate, police can police, and yet we think of them as like performing magical functions, and when they don't, we get really upset about them. So I've rambled a lot, but that's kind of my first cut on that question.
Well, I think that this, oh, sorry.
No, I was
Go
just
ahead.
saying, there's only one way prisons fail as far as people are concerned, and that's when somebody escapes. That's a prison failure. Everything else we ask prisons to do, we're hopeful, we're praying, we're say, please do something to this guy, rehabilitate him. If that's at all possible, if you remember, you know, the Quakers established the prison system, the penitentiary to be penitent, locked people up, kept them by themselves, and we're surprised it didn't work out well.
So
we've been surprised things aren't working out well for hundreds of years.
I love the history of prisons, and I think typically we don't think of prisons as having a history. But you know, depending how you kind of do this, you can say Americans more or less invented prisons, and it's with the Quakers, and prisons were a kind of humane intervention. You know, before punishment was done through banishment or corporal punishment, things like that. And you know, the early founders of prisons thought, you know, prisons should correct. And so there was a humane element to prisons. And the theory was, though, if you lock someone in a room, in a dark room, and you don't let them talk to inmates or anyone else, God will come and help them become better, right? That's the theory of prison, ultimately. And like very quickly, the early founders of prisons learned it does not work that way. It's a nice idea, but and actually people started going insane. They started cutting themselves. Sexual abuse became pretty rampant. This is early prison stuff. And so it seems like, you know, that early experiment with incarceration, we learned a pretty profound limitation to these things, but we never like incorporated it. And instead, we keep on coming back to it and keep coming back to it, keep thinking, oh, well, you know, if we just tweak our use of prison in this little way, something magical will happen. And I think, to me, it's an interesting question, given that we've been doing this for 200 plus years, why haven't we learned more about it? Because some of the lessons are pretty immediate.
You know, John, if you think about it, like you said and I said, you know, the original penitent part of prisons didn't work, and here 200 plus years later, we still have solitary confinement.
Yeah.
We have still not learned the first lesson, or not remembered the first lesson, I guess is a better way to express it.
So I want to talk about now where we're coming from. How have we changed here in Illinois? So John, I want to ask you, let's talk about how the criminal justice landscape looked when you first started working in this field in Illinois.
Well, definitely, please, everyone else jump in, but I think it's, so I started working in this space kind of somewhat accidentally about 10 years ago maybe. And it was just not a very crowded field. Certainly you had folks like the ACLU doing litigation type work. There were, I guess, folks I would consider more kind of traditional prison reform advocates. But it was, I mean, so I worked at this place called the John Howard Association. It's the state's only nonpartisan prison watchdog. And I came in kind of as the organization was really in like a very bad place. So I came in to kind of help fix it and help raise money. And one of the things I quickly found myself is I was the kind of de facto expert on prisons in the state, which I had no qualifications really to be. So I assumed that role and just tried to learn as much as I could, and you know, to talk to as many people as I could who had experienced this kind of work. But it was a lonely space, and so Ben can talk about this because he was in the House at the time as a legislative staffer. And when I would go to I started going to Springfield and write op-eds, the more I learned. And what was nice about being at the John Howard Association, I would go to prison, so I would see prison conditions, and that gave me kind of a particular perspective to speak about. But it was a lonely field. There was really like very few people doing this work. And I would say the kind of the automatic reactions people had in the legislature or in rooms like this to the idea of reforming prisons were didn't go over very well, I guess. People were scared to have at the legislature, people just were scared to have the conversation. And then I would say, you know, Illinois kind of, and it was nice because when I would go talk about it, I would talk about places like Right on Crime and how, you know, really Illinois had a delayed kind of response to criminal justice reform across the country. And then all of a sudden I felt we went into hyper mode. And, you know, so I went into government and I kind of left some of that behind, but it seems to me like it's a much more crowded field now. There are conversations like the ACLU and Illinois Policy Institute. I mean, that to me that would not have been possible, I think, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Yeah, I mean, that would have been crazy. Maybe it's still kind of crazy. I love it. I think it's so important. But I think the field has radically changed. And I guess and it was great. I think the early moments of that change, I think people were open to the idea like, oh, maybe this way we do things isn't right, and maybe it's too expensive, and maybe it's not effective. So there was a space of, I think, real opportunity. Again, I've been away from some of the advocacy in my role in government, but what I'm afraid of is that that space has become, one, there's a lot more people in it, which is probably a good thing, but it's become pretty shrill. And instead of asking questions like, what kind of system do we want? How do we get there? I think people come with answers they're very committed to, and they want to fight about it. And so I think you see a lot of anger-driving discourse, which I think is, especially in this work, never a good thing.
And I'd like to hear from you too, how you think the field has changed and what you've seen over the past few years.
Sure, thank you. As John mentioned, I came from a legislative staff position before I was at the ACLU, and I guess John and I must have entered the criminal justice field around the same time, because it was about 10 years ago for me that I started that position in 2008, actually working for the House Republican leader, who was Tom Cross at the time, and then his successor, Jim Durkin. And I was a practicing attorney before that, but I was not a criminal lawyer. always had an interest in criminal law, but my expertise, such as it is, about this system was formed through that policy-making lens, actually, in Springfield, like having to become an expert about something. And it really quickly became evident to me in that role that even not knowing a lot, as I didn't at the time, about the system, the nuts and bolts goings on of the system, and what happened in courtrooms, and what happened in prisons, and what happened with probation officers. I knew after a short time of watching how criminal justice policy was made in Illinois that that's not how to make policy. Like whatever is coming out of this sausage factory is not likely to be serving the state of Illinois and its people well, because it's such a fear-driven, kind of reactionary, headlines, things ripped from the headlines that become laws overnight, often with somebody's victim's name attached to it. And that's how we make criminal justice policy, or that's how we were making it. And I got the strong sense that that's how we'd been making it for many years. This is 2008, so things didn't start then. They started long before that, as far as this sort of tough on crime mentality of how policy is made. And I would say that lasted maybe 3 or 4 more years of where just any sort of increase in penalties, any additional punitive sanction was a policy that was an easy sell, and people weren't too concerned about the costs or whether these policies were actually doing anything to make the state of Illinois safer, or to make people feel that there's a just system of laws. And then you started to see the ground shift a few years in, where there was they stemmed the flow of those policies. The committees in Springfield started to do what committees are always meant to do, which is deliberate about legislation and stop things that aren't ready for prime time to go from going further in the process. And so, there was an unwillingness for those folks to assume that role and to say, like, hey, this may sound good, this may appeal to our sense of vengeance here, but it's not good policy for the state of Illinois. And then, we had some people that, to their credit, assumed those roles and said, enough is enough. And we weren't putting the car in reverse, but we were at least putting the brakes on. And then Governor Rauner was elected, and he, to his great credit, took leadership on this issue and said, we have a broken criminal justice system, we have an overcrowded prison system, we need to de-incarcerate, we need to do it safely and deliberatively, but we need to do it. Here's a goal. Appointed a commission. That commission was full of serious folks, and they took their task seriously. They came up with a very detailed and specific roadmap in the form of their final report, which is still online and available, and has 27 great recommendations, almost none of which have been enacted into law to this date. And so, we've seen some halting progress. We've seen some great reforms happen. I don't want to minimize that, because after putting the brakes on, we have seen some of the recommendations in that commission, some of what I would call the lower hanging fruit from that commission report, as well as just some very well thought out and hard fought for policies that were mentioned in the introduction, like reform of sealing and expungement and civil asset forfeiture and some of those things. So there has been progress, but there's so much more progress to be made, and I would say that we've got a great roadmap to do it, but and so over the long period of time that I've been observing things, I guess to wrap up this long spiel is that things have moved in a positive direction from our standpoint as far as backing away from enacting more and ever more punitive and harsh policies that are perpetuating mass incarceration, and stopping all of that and beginning to go down the road of repairing the damage. But there's a lot further to go down that road.
So Derek, as an outsider looking in on Illinois, what do you see? And what do you see in other states too that may be similar or different approaches?
Well, actually, I think Ben hit the nail right on the head. I think that there has been incremental change, but warranted incremental change. Low-hanging fruit is, I think, somewhat dismissive, but I think not inaccurate as way of describing it, because so much more can be done specifically in those policy areas that the reforms went through in. When Illinois fits into kind of the national conversation on criminal justice, it's one of a handful of states, and we tend to see the bigger exceptions are the ones grabbing the headlines. The Texas's prison reform has been much ballyhooed in the space, and it was substantial. The way we were one of the first that did a large-scale reinvestment style reform that focuses more on what are the systemic cost drivers, what are the better predictors of recidivism, how can we minimize the criminogenic effects of prisons, so on and so forth. But the truth be told, it wasn't because we had this great soul-searching moment in the state and said, there has to be a better way. We were broke. We were flat broke. We did not have, basically from 1990 to 2000, over both governors Richards and Bush, we built almost 100,000 prison beds. State of 20 million people at the time. 100,000 new, not existing stock, new prison beds over a decade. It got to a point where we had procurement issues for cement. It was getting that bad. And we basically got to the point in 2005 where the Speaker of the House is like, I have to set this budget and I am not going to make another red cent available for capital expansion of prison. Well, our prison population was still growing apace. Now granted, our crime rate, basically went over the cliff about 1994-ish, but of course our prison population just kept going. And so Jerry Madden, who was appointed, and this is where the story becomes gospel, the way he tells it, basically was told by the Speaker when he was appointed corrections chair, just don't build new prisons, they cost too much. And that was the only guidance he was given. So they took a run at it in 2005. We have a biennial legislature, so luckily we limit the amount of time they can do damage to us. We say you can only get 6 months every 2 years. Have at it. But they tried in 2005, and Governor Perry actually vetoed the bill. Now, in 2005, that legislative approach was, there was a lot of learning on the job. It was, similar to the environment you came in. There wasn't a lot of expertise or institutional knowledge on the Texas prison system, especially one that maybe was counterintuitive or going against the status quo at the time. And so come back in 2007, they had a better, more polished package. They had more stakeholder support from prosecutors, from probation officers, because probation officers would be, taking a much larger caseload under this particular system reform. And essentially, they got that through with the support of those stakeholders. Now, what I'm not telling you is in the 18-month interim that the prison population went up 2%. And again, that's full capacity. The prison population went up 2%, which is huge for Texas's population just in terms of raw numbers. So with that going forward, they basically had no option but to look into this, again, I say reinvestment style reform, which again focuses on the cost drivers, focuses on making sure the jail space is functionally reserved for those who actually do have a high recidivism threat, especially violent offenders. And the whole issue of political palatability came up, it did, but there was an understanding like there's no other way to do this. So there was almost like a speaker-enforced armistice, and this was written about in the Dagan and Tellis book on Texas's example. They basically said, look, we need to just basically lay down our arms, and we can bicker about school funding, we can bicker about property tax, but we can't politicize this. And those who did try to, and some, it's a body of 150 members in the House, there were people that tried to politicize it, and there was due discipline enforced upon them. And essentially, that was how Texas was able to move forward, was kind of just a unilateral armistice on the issue. Now, there's been some discussion prior to and discussion here, and John said that the tenor is becoming more shrill. I think that is true. I don't think that's limited just to criminal justice. I think it's more of the kind of ecological political climate that we're in right now. How that will fare in criminal justice, I think, is still an unwritten book. The one problem, though, is that what we should want not to happen is for crime to resurge into public consciousness as it was prior to. Because remember when crime was a #1 issue that drove people to the polls and really, drove the debate? That was like 1970s through 1990s. And I would look back on the reforms that we've made there. I would be hard-pressed to find an example of policy that came out of that period that we would want to enforce today.
I just have to jump in here because I think we see currently here in Illinois and in the city of Chicago an attempt to make use scary headlines about crime to enact policies that are really wrong-headed and fit the mold of what we were doing in the 70s through the 90s. You hear a lot of talk about carjacking here in Chicago. There's been an increase in the incidence of carjacking, and so the city of Chicago has a bill out there that really deals more with people charged with possessing a stolen motor vehicle, which is an entirely different offense than putting a gun in somebody's face and taking their car away. But they've conflated the two issues successfully enough that there's all this momentum behind this supposed carjacking bill in Springfield. People know they don't like carjacking and that's happening and they would like a response. But the city's response is to, one, conflate this with a different issue, and two, kind of put it on like some new law coming from Springfield is going to be the thing to correct that, as opposed to the, increasing the vanishingly small number of these people who are doing these carjackings who actually get arrested and made to pay any consequence at all. And
I think don't let that point go unheeded, is that we as a people, as a society, are punitive. We are punitive. Francis Cullen has done research on, basically survey research and surveys that we actually tried to replicate in Texas, that they found that people are punitive. We have a visceral, and I'd say vestigial, desire to punish those who have, done acts of moral opprobrium. That's something that sets us apart from the animals. The problem is we're not very good at yoking our own, prejudices and desires in doing so. And so when it comes to laws like that, and you ask anybody who looks at criminal justice policy more than an inch deep, and you say, hey, I have a law with a name on it, so-and-so's law, just massive cringes across the whole group, because what he described is actually how that thrusts into being. He goes, here we have a pretty atypical case that happened to somebody named so-and-so, and that this person is going to be basically the avatar for this push, because we don't want more, one so-and-so is enough, we don't want two. However, we engage in this basically facetious way of lawmaking around it. As Ben said, we're not actually doing anything about carjacking. We're talking about possession of a stolen vehicle. We have the same thing going on to push out of Dallas right now, where a child in the Asian Indian community was basically murdered and abandoned. And so now that child's name has become the avatar for something that has to do with, very low-level CPS stuff. I don't want to spoil anybody, but we're from Texas. We already have murder on the books, and several permutations of it, too. This law that they're trying to pass would have not in one single inflection point have changed what happened to that poor child. But the point is, it's like, if you do not like this, we are going to basically paint you as, oh, you're anti-child, you're pro-child murder.
Right? No, I think this is so important, and I think, I think when we engage in these discussions, I think it's important to understand where that reaction comes from. And I think I agree with Derek. It's a kind of a natural reaction when something really bad happens. There's a kind of a punishment thing kicks in. on some level, I mean, I don't know, like if I hit my head on my shelf or something, I might punch it. You know, I'm not deterred anything, but I just said anger, it's very natural. And I think it's unfortunately, there's a short circuit there between our natural reaction, horror, I mean, often totally like understandable horror, remorse, and making law, which is never a good thing. And I think one of the kind of the legacy we're in, I think this is kind of human nature we're talking about. The problem is, though, there's no buffer anymore. I mean, and essentially, if you look back at kind of the history of criminal justice policymaking and law, beginning in the 60s, it seems that like before that period, you know, if we were to have a discussion like this, we wouldn't be talking about what state lawmakers can do to address crime or even federal, right? It would be a local level thing. And this is really kind of the more I work on this is more where my head is. These are, you know, crime is a local problem. It should be addressed locally. It's a hard problem. It's a wicked problem in many ways. There's very little a state legislature can do to address that. But when we come to them and say, this awful thing happened, what are you going to do about it? The expectation is, I have to do something. And the reality is, though, the better response would be, there's just nothing I can do about that, unfortunately. But I think, again, our culture, that is so baked into how we do policymaking. It's so baked into our culture. I don't know how we ever get that back. It's a very effective political tool. But that's part of the problem, is that we changed our practices, you know, late 60s or so. There's a legacy of that we're still living in. And I mean, I think just realistically, I don't know how we get out of it, but as long as that's there, as long as we expect legislators, governors, even like senators, you know, to address crime, I think we're going to have the situation that we're in.
John, I've said before, I'll say it again, that when the legislators need jerks, you don't want to be standing too close because it's going to hurt. And the people that pay are the people who are on the wrong side of whatever act is the popular act at the time, because the legislatures want to do something because the constituents are begging them for it. I thought it interesting that Ben talked about working for Tom Cross. I distributed materials for Tom in his first run. So I've known Tom a long time. I watched his legislative rise, and the first job of a legislator is not to serve the constituents, it's to get reelected. And if they need to pass Johnny's bill or Phil's bill or Megan's bill to get reelected, it doesn't matter the consequence. They want to go back and get the law passed because you don't want to run and have the other side go, you're in favor of child molesters? You're in favor of carjackers? That's what this guy's talking about. That's the problem. I mean, I don't know how to answer that. And we've been talking about the system is broken. All right, let me be the one to say it's not broken. It's flawed. What we ask the system to do, it does, and in a lot of cases, just incredibly well. To the extent it's possible, the courts protect the rights of the accused. They make sure that the indigent has a lawyer. And then after that part, the system tends to fall apart because, all right, we convicted them, now what do we do with them?
I want to stay on you, David, though, because I remember we were talking earlier and I made the comment that you operate outside politics and outside prisons for the most part. So you're talking about politics right now, and when you're working with clients, how does this affect your perspective?
I think what I said before and what I still think, I don't work outside politics. I sometimes think politics works on me because we'll talk to someone accused of a crime and we'll have to explain to them. I guess the best way to understand it from my perspective is I was talking to a gentleman about his kid a long time ago, and I still see this in my mind's eye. We're sitting in the small conference room, and I told him about the punishments his kid was facing, and his dad says, well, that doesn't apply to people like us, does it? Well, as a matter of fact, it does. It's colorblind, race blind, and class blind. You're right. Your very well-to-do kid is going to face the same type of punishment as somebody not so well-to-do. He was shocked. And so we have to react in my business. We have to see what the legislature is doing, what it's done, what we're facing, and then try to do our best for our clients. Someone earlier in the earlier discussion said that the criminal justice system is the spear of government, and I said my job is to keep that spear from going through my client. That's what I do. Try to protect them as best as I can and use the resources available.
And so we've started talking about people, and I think that I'd like to continue going down that track. So we're talking a lot about policy, we're talking a lot about trends. Let's talk a lot about the people who are going through this system and who they are and how they're affected after they get out.
I mean, one of the things, I don't know if it made me unique or not, but when I came to this organization, the John Howard Association, I'd done work in wrongful conviction reform, but really I was coming out of like poverty work. I didn't really have any, I'm sure at the time I would have had very normal intuitions about punishment. Going to a prison, at least in Illinois, seeing how people are treated. And I always say too, I want to make sure I'm clear, I have tremendous respect for correctional officers and the people who work within the criminal justice system. It's a really difficult system. We ask them to do impossible things and often don't give them the resources to do it. All that being said, when you go to a prison and you see how people are treated, I don't know how you could walk away from that and say this is a good thing to do. And I think on some level, I would say it's as much about the people who are incarcerated as about who we are as a people. I just thought, so let me just give you, I want to make sure everyone has a chance to talk, but let me give you a really quick story. So when I came in and started doing the work I was doing around prisons, it was right when Illinois' prison population was really spiking. Right now we're around 40,000 people. When I kind of at the peak when I was working in around prisons, it was 49 something. So horrific, really pretty horrific overcrowded conditions. And on one prison trip, I visited two facilities. One was Tams Correctional Center, which was a prison dedicated to solitary confinement. It was at the time the most expensive prison we have per inmate. People were held in super isolation. Horrific. I mean, again, these people who were there, I'll be very clear, were there for probably very good reasons. Many of them were dangerous to have in general population, but they were doing things like self-mutilating. Going insane. It just, again, I don't know how you could walk in there and say this is something we should do to someone in a society that claims to value people's civil liberties and human rights. The next prison we visited, I'm pretty sure it was on the same trip, was Vienna Correctional Center, which at the time was the most overcrowded prison. And so it was a minimum security prison. People who were there for 5 to 6 months, maybe up to a year at a time. And they were being housed in this one part. Literally it was a barn they had kind of repurposed, and there were these kind of portable bunk beds. And the windows were broken out. There were birds who had nested. There was bird feces on the floor. There were like mice running around. And it just seemed like, and people who were there for things like shoplifting. And let's be clear, they weren't just like one shoplifting, probably multiple accounts. So again, people who were very problematic individuals in many ways. But I couldn't think, and they had no programming. They were literally kind of sitting in there and stewing. And I just thought, and again, I can't imagine anyone walking into that and just thinking, oh, this is the right thing to do. Because those people too, so it's a shoplifter, right? And maybe it's a shoplifter, kind of your typical shoplifter might have like a mental illness, diagnosed or undiagnosed, substance abuse issues, pretty long rap sheet, probably no violent crimes, maybe one or two, but just kind of you're just someone who kind of churns through the system. So I would say a person with some pretty difficult problems, but our answer to them is to stick them into like a repurposed barn with another 500 inmates and let them stew for 6 months. Like how is that going to, I just thought that was, again, I can't understand how you would see that as a humane response, but two, just on a very utilitarian level of if this is effective, there's no way it's effective. So, that's the reality. I think things have gotten better, but our prison system is very old. It's very expensive, but the reality is if we were to be serious about treatment and programming, we probably need to spend more money on it that we don't have. But right now, I think the reality is, if we send someone to our Department of Corrections, the expectation they come out better, not worse, is pretty unrealistic.
Hillary, you said we want to talk about the people. And more times than I care to remember, I've been in front of a judge with a person who has been convicted or has pled guilty, And the question essentially is, all right, Mr. Kamek, what do you think I should do to this guy? You're asking me, the judge, to decide what's an appropriate sanction. And sometimes the judge's hands are tied because of mandatory minimum sentencing. Or sometimes my client has just made it so hard for themselves that you got to almost, and I would never do this, but sometimes you almost want to shrug and say, I don't know what you can do to him, Judge. He wouldn't listen to me. I mean, he's on his own. I don't do that. I view my job at sentencing is to make that defendant as much of a real person as I possibly can. And sometimes it's difficult, but for the most part, you can find something to say and something to do and personalize these persons, so if the judge knows he's not sentencing the defendant, he's sentencing a person with the first and last name and with the family and a history and all that. It's hard. It's hard, I'm sure, for the judge to decide what to do. And I think sometimes the judges are given a gift by mandatory minimum sentences. I mean, this is Illinois. We have mandatory minimum sentences for driving with a suspended driver's license where you have to go to jail or something. So I think sometimes it's an easy out. Just treat him as a defendant. Go ahead.
And I would add to that just, I think a valuable perspective that, you know, this panel is uniquely able to talk about the defendant side of the, or the, you know, convicted side of the system. I like to talk about the victim side and then the general public. And I do think that certain crimes confer a moral authority on victimhood that is wrongly interpreted. That's not to say that their input is not valid. We do a horrible job of actually having victims involved in our system. But this is why it actually resonates, specifically in Texas, why restorative justice, you know, in the proper term of art, actually resonates in Texas, because what you're doing is minimizing the actual state's impact on the criminal proceeding and having it more of a mediated response. Now, a bit of that, and we were talking about it earlier, a bit of that is a little pie in the sky, and admittedly so. But let's take a look at it as a practical example, because let's say you have a victim of a crime, and that victim is owed however much in restitution. After the courts take their cut, after any attorneys take their cut, you know, we're basically talking about a person who committed this offense who might be indigent as well, and so they basically are pay what they can. It gets diverted to the state. They might default on their actual payments, and then they end up locked up, either in jail or in prison, and now nobody's getting paid. And so this is one of the issues that we've dealt with in Texas is, you know, and you see all this quote-unquote debtors prisons legislation, is that simply facilitating ways to make people better able to satisfy any sort of such judgments actually is pro-victim. And that's one of the areas of reform that I think gets overlooked, is how these actually benefit victims. Now, let's talk about society in general. And I think that this is where a lot of this rancor is starting to bubble up, and we talked about this caustic time that we're in right now. As right now, you know, there's federal legislation that focuses on reentry, and as a matter of policy and branding, it does not at all touch sentencing. And sentencing is something that both in the federal and state level almost unanimously does need to be reformed and tweaked in several ways, because we recognize that prisons, like them or leave them. I agree with David that I think that it's our prison, you know, the system works great. We got the system that we've created, and that's the problem. But like them or leave them, you know, we are just letting people out without any sort of rehabilitation. The rehabilitation we do isn't always necessarily, you know, high fidelity to a good working treatment model. And, you know, it was also made, the point was made earlier that when we do the same treatment in non-carceral settings, we tend to get better results using the same exact modality. And so moving forward, I don't know if we actually can get to a place where we say there is no longer a need for prisons, but we are definitely moving beyond where we were, which was prison is the default for everything. And now we're understanding that alternatives exist, alternative forms of supervision exist if somebody should be supervised at all. But that in and of itself, if we recognize the criminogenic effect of prison and the positive but somewhat limited rehabilitation effects that they can have, you know, it is an issue of public safety what we do after that door closes too. And I think that that's something that's a bit lost in the discussion.
To the question of talking about the people and the people that are touched by the criminal justice system, we've been talking for over an hour about the criminal justice system without mentioning the issue of race. And the criminal justice system touches people of color much greater and much harder than it touches anybody else. And that remains the case. And it's not even close. And so we have to focus on the fact that the people that are bearing the brunt of the criminal justice system are people from a fairly small number of communities that were already communities struggling with low employment, low economic investment, and now they're dealing with the effects of mass incarceration as well. And so, I think when David talks about his need to personalize the defendant and make the judge see that person as a person, as an individual, I think, racism is one of the big reasons why criminal defendants have not been seen as, why they've been dehumanized, depersonalized. And it's also a reason, the disproportionality of the system is also, I think, I don't know if in the other story that David told about the client parents saying, does this law really apply to people like us? I don't know for a fact that those people were white, but I would bet that they probably were white to ask that question. And there's a reason why a white person would ask, do these laws really apply to people like us? Because the laws as written are colorblind. They're not written to apply to one race and not another. But we know how these laws are enforced, how policing and prosecution and sentencing has produced this great disproportionality. And I would submit that part of reform, in addition to correcting that, which is a huge enough project in and of itself, is also to repair the damage that's been done in those communities by our by mass incarceration, and reinvest in the communities that have borne the brunt of these misguided policies, which are overwhelmingly communities of color.
Well, I'll piggyback off of what Ben just brought up too. So you mentioned also that folks who are experiencing the criminal justice system, whether they are just, getting a short sentence or they're in prison for 10 years or so, they're eventually, most of them are going to come out. They're going to re-enter society. And so where the Illinois Policy Institute has come in is actually, we've been looking at the re-entry side. So what actually happens to these people when they've served their time and they need to
the rubric of fair chance hiring, we passed that in Austin, and it simply basically said you cannot, you basically need to have that provisional job offer on the board. And so not only is it increasing human resources overhead, you're also keeping people basically in the lurch without having to move on to accept other jobs. And I think that the better way of approaching that is something that we did in Texas, was civilly indemnifying employers. make it more attractive or less cumbersome for employers to hire folks who are reentering society. Do the same thing for landlords. Instead of letting them being, just sued for negligence, and we had a broader negligence statute in Texas, let them actually have a limited civil indemnification on renting to people. Because, stability in housing is a very key predictive factor in recidivism. And so these are things where the government is actually in the way that we should clear out. When it comes to the actual record itself, we've actually, we have a system called non-disclosure in Texas, which still complies with a lot of the federal mandates insofar as, ports, sensitive facilities need to have access to these criminal records. But we essentially can mask it from almost anything else. And is it perfect? No. Does it cover, the entire gamut of offenses? No. But we were able to take it from a misdemeanor only bill to a now certain, make it retroactive. And now even one of the big, I had to say, wins of the last session is that now it actually applies to first-time DWIs, which everyone's like, oh, got to be careful. MAD might get mad about that. And MAD actually supported that because they realize how quickly it is, how that one DUI, if unmitigated or if all these other collateral consequences attend that, how quickly that becomes 2, 4, et cetera, and then you're actually getting the person involved in the prison system.
Can I 100% agree. I do think it's very hard. I mean, I work in government. I believe in government. However, I think in this space, I think it's very difficult for the government to do productive good. And I think oftentimes when it comes in to do good, it ends up bringing a lot of unintended consequences. Let's say government's got a role to play here, and I think we need to be very thoughtful about that, but also careful to look for unintended consequences. I think almost always attached to this kind of work. But I think, along with what Derek said, to me, one of the biggest drivers of people going back to prison after their release is the cynicism which prison breeds, and I think that we participate in. I think one of the things, like as advocates, and I certainly am guilty of this, we talk about people in prison as if they're lost causes, that you can never return, you can never find a job, and that's just not true. I think what's amazing about prison, I think, is that people find ways to live really human lives in a very inhuman place, and I think as a society we should do more to lift that kind of stuff up. All the success stories we have, and people who come to prison. It's absolutely true. I think it's amazing. People who leave prison, who've changed their lives. I've been able to talk. I love this kind of question, and I almost always get the same answer. When someone's really changed their life, who's say call them a career criminal or her a career criminal, they almost always want to do one thing, which is help young people who are like them. And so often, the laws we have, the policies we have, we prevent that. So I think finding ways to kind of, get government out of the way of that is absolutely, again, finding what government should do, and we should ask that question, we should be very careful about that question, but also realize that human beings can do really remarkable things when they're allowed to, and we stifle that. Yeah. Right, I got some applause.
We're going to take audience questions, so we'll let you know when that section comes up. Ben, go ahead. Just
a quick word. I think I'm in accordance with a lot of what my fellow panelists have had to say about, like, re-entry is incredibly important, and we've done so much harm. We've labeled so many people felons and created these barriers that it's our moral responsibility to create ways to get around them and to give people relief to whom we've done that harm. But what we really need to be doing, in addition to that, but what we got to do both, is quit making so many people criminals in the first place, and specifically quit making so many people felons, because that felony conviction is the thing that has to be expunged, that has to have, that we're banning the box about. And there are crimes that, for instance, marijuana, we're having a nationwide conversation about whether that should even be a crime, and a lot of states have opted to make it not a crime. And so there's a drug policy that has made a lot of people felons because they have a drug addiction, or because they have a mental illness of some sort that has led them to use drugs or to engage in some other criminal behavior. So it's not just a sentencing reform thing. We need to address that behavior, but we need to address it in a way that doesn't put this stamp on people that needs to be expunged, or we need to ban the box about. We need to not make so many people criminals in the first place.
I'd actually add to that, Ben. I think that's 100% correct, and that can all be aggregated up into this issue of stigma. Which if there is some sort of macabre benefit to all this, if so many felons, we all know them. We all know one. We all know people that have had brush-ins with the law. So it's almost a antiquated way of thinking. Like, well, I have a morally upright person, and I live a life of moral rectitude. Therefore, I have no worries about coming in contact with the criminal justice system. And I just saw that piece in Reason about, what was it, 2 or 3 weeks ago, about the way that people are getting impounded and fined here. And I was about to say, if you deserve to lose your car because you didn't read a sign that was probably obscured by a tree, that's not a criminal justice system. That is something that is essentially a money-making venture of the state, and it's doing so through trickery. And so I think that if there's one side of that, the stigma is dissipating itself. You have actually corporate partners that are unilaterally not inquiring about criminal history. I think that's great. It should be lauded when it happens. Your Walmarts, your Targets, your Coke Industries, so on and so forth. And then you also have the folks that are saying, you know what, we're going to inquire about it, because people that have had have been incarcerated and have came out and have, taken the reins of their own rehabilitation, that is a skill set in and of itself, and I want that person working for my corporation. So there are people that use it as positive hiring information as well. And that's, again, to John's point, when we start talking about government trying to regulate how that's done, sometimes that's positive information.
Hillary, as we're having this discussion talking about stigma, I have 2 clients right now who their family members have called me because they're registered sex offenders, who said they can't be released until they find a place to go. And the Department of Corrections will get an address, they'll send a parole agent, and if it's near a park, a bus stop, a school, much tighter restrictions than the statute requires, they're not getting out. And that's the kind of nobody's in favor of pedophiles, nobody's in favor of sex abusers, but unless they're the type who are going to be kept forever, and we do that for some people, we keep them forever because they're dangerous. After their sentence has expired, they're committed, we keep them forever. If it's someone getting out, then we have to realize that the collateral consequence to registering them, a sex offender or a violence against youth offender, which at times can apply to 2 brothers fighting in an underage system, I think we have to realize that there's some things that need to be changed, and unless we're willing to buy wholesale some drastic changes, some things aren't going to change at all.
So you're talking about change too. I want to make sure that we talk about what we do moving forward. I want to make sure we cover that. So we've talked about some great wins that Illinois has seen over the past few years, whether it's reforming our civil asset forfeiture laws, reforming our ceiling rules, licensing reform, all of that. Ben, what do we still need to do as a state and within our communities?
Well, we still need to reduce penalties for all drug offenses from top to bottom. The drug penalties are completely out of whack with what people actually think they are or what they need to be, and just move toward a public health approach to dealing with substance use disorders, and stop throwing so many people in prison for drug crimes, and then also look at the property crimes, many of which are directly related to or overlap with those drug offenses. But these are the things that, when I talked about low-hanging fruit before from the Governor's Commission report, these are the kinds of things I'm talking about, because what makes them low-hanging fruit? The public is there already. The public has been there for years. ACLU pulled these issues statewide in 2015. IPI pulled these issues a year or 2 later. The public support for not imprisoning people for nonviolent offenses like shoplifting and drug possession is there. It's strong. It's bipartisan. We need to act on that. And we've got a bipartisan commission report saying we should do it. So the legislature needs to take action. The governor needs to support what's in that commission report. We also need to look at the length of stay. The people who are serving extremely lengthy sentences for crimes that are violent crimes, that, there's not a lot of public support for, in the way that there is for saying, yeah, we shouldn't send drug offenders, property offenders to prison. People don't feel that way about people who commit rape and murder. Nevertheless, we have to reckon with the fact that we have one of the least flexible systems as far as length of stay and what kind of relief can be granted as far as reducing somebody's length of stay after they've been incarcerated. And we have no parole system in Illinois. We have determinate sentencing and we have so-called truth in sentencing. So the crime that you're convicted of basically predetermines how many days you're going to spend in prison, irrespective of any other considerations or what you do with yourself while you're incarcerated or what the risk it might be of releasing you. We think we can decide all those things in the legislature and not allow actors in other parts of the system to decide that. And so, we can reform our truth in sentencing laws. We can go back to some kind of a parole system, which unless you were sentenced before 1978, you get no parole hearing in Illinois. So those are just a few of the things. And we need to stop sending people to prison for periods of 4 months or 6 months where you're not doing anything constructive. You're just throwing away money and possibly making somebody worse by churning them through this system that is not rehabilitative, quite the contrary.
I mean, I think really quickly, I agree with Ben. There's really important reforms at the state level that need to be addressed. The more I'm in this, though, the more I think the action's really at the local level. Criminal justice, even with mandatory minimums, even with kind of the constricted system we have, remains a local level activity. I think there's so much more creativity and collaboration at the local level than you find at the state level, and ultimately, even to say like in a mandatory minimum type of structure, there's still discretion being exercised at the local level, whether it's policing or in the courts. And so I think that's where the action I think needs to be. And oftentimes, the work that I've got to do in the agency that I run now, when you go to the local level and you explain, oftentimes they don't quite know. They don't fully understand the system that they're in because they're doing so much, and they don't quite understand how policing might affect jails, and jails might affect a prison, and then people come back to prison. They don't quite see all the pieces. The state can help provide a more system perspective, the data that can help them make sense of it, and then you empower them to make better decisions. And I think when you do that, and it's not a magical thing because obviously politics is on top and all the way down, and sometimes people don't like working together. But when the state helps provide an environment for local level actors to collaborate, to work together, really important things happen. And that's not about changing statutes. That's just about, I think, government doing what it should do.
Where I practice in Kane, DuPage County, but Kane County State's Attorney actually has had, for a great number of years, their own diversion program, where a person charged with certain felonies, and they've even adopted into domestic battery cases, can go through the state's attorney's diversion program, much like the Cook County's drug diversion program existed at one point, that go through without a conviction. By the same token, I was part of a panel for the IPI at some point in the past, and the state's attorney came up to me and said, "So you don't like the mandatory minimums, huh?" He says, "We need those." Well, I respectively disagree, but it's the same prosecutor doing both things. These guys get diversions, but I want the mandatory minimums because I want that sword to hang over the head of certain people. And let's face it, certain people belong in prison. They really do.
I think he hits on a very good point, is that is necessarily, this is more of an arcane legal philosophy question, but is the prosecutor the one with whom that power should be vested? And when it comes to a comparative model, our adversarial system, would generally say the judge, but the judge is not allowed to make charging decisions. Is there an answer? I don't know. On the issue of mandatory minimums, though, that's one of the areas that in Texas, how many think, just how many mandatory minimums do you think we have in Texas? 0. Because we have very broad sentencing brackets in which, because everyone talked about truth in sentencing, 85% laws, things like that, we were satisfying those without having to pass the mandatory minimums back in the back after the '94 crime bill went through. Now we do have certain escalators and certain enhancements for certain offenses, but generally we really trust our judges with the discretion that it takes to put these people away, those who are deserving. Now, of course, our judges also have to stand for election, and that's a whole nother thing for a whole nother time. But really, our system is one that reflects various inputs of discretion at each level. Now, of course, the problem being, you know, that discretion can be weaponized, as I think a lot of us are dancing around right up here, weaponized specifically against certain communities. And essentially, at the end of the day, people have to be accountable for that. And that's why, you know, I think it's good that we're starting to come, and I'm speaking for Texas, but I hope this applies broadly, especially in Illinois. We're starting to come out of the wilderness of tough on crime rhetoric, delivering tangible political gains. And I made this point earlier as we were talking about it. Look in the large elections when you've seen tough on crime attack, you know, the Willie Horton style stuff from the 80s, but in modern parlance. We've seen it in Alaska in 2014. We've seen it in the governor's race in Louisiana in 2016. Essentially, when these attacks are being aired, they go over like a lead balloon, and they're basically in the death rattles of a campaign. Usually when you have to go there, you're looking at some internal polling and saying, I think we should try for a Hail Mary because there's no more blood in that turnip anymore. And so maybe that's overly optimistic because there also hasn't been as high profile incident that has made hay in the way that the Willie Horton case has. But I think that that's something that we should be cognizant of, is that I think that's at least at a point of diminishing returns at this point.
Can I add one just very quick point? And I wonder if this is part of the alliance between IPI and the ACLU. I think it's in the nature of power to want power. And so when you have people who have power and they make excuses for why they need a certain element because it gives them more power, I think your two organizations are great because it's like be careful of that, you know, like, and I don't think that's so. I'm not trying to make any kind of moral judgment. It's just structural. It's intrinsic, and so I think part of what our system does really well, and it's probably why I think it needs a lot of help, is that it concentrates power into very few hands, and I think I don't think that's a good thing.
I wanted to jump in real quick because something John said, my earlier comment, maybe I was focused on state level reforms because that's what I primarily work on, and you may have sensed some frustration about thinking that more should be done, but John is right about the action being at the local level. And one state level reform that I should talk about, because it kind of focuses on the fact that we've really got, we don't have a system that the parts work seamlessly together. We have different systems, and different actors have different incentives. So one of the dynamics I've learned about in talking to prosecutors is that a reason people get sent to prison, especially for a lower level offense, is because the person is a nuisance in the community. They keep turning up, and they don't know what to do with this person. And there's a thing that they can do, which is ship them off somewhere else at someone else's expense to prison. And so that's a decision, that's a dynamic that drives decisions to imprison people. And what's come online in the last few years is the Adult Redeploy Illinois program, which the state actually incentivizes local communities to either enact a plan of their own making or continue a successful program to keep from sending so many people to the state prison system. Actually gives them financial incentive to do that, and it's a successful program because it allows the locals to be creative in that way and to be the ones that solve the problem of, like, look, these people are coming back to our communities anyway. How do we address their problems in a real way, rather than just have a 4-month respite from this bothersome individual who's then going to come back to us with the same problems or worse ones.
You know, to talk about this fictional defendant you have where is a nuisance to the community, it's what I alluded to before, where the judge will say, Mr. Kamek, we've tried conditional discharge, we've tried probation, we've tried a short jail sentence. It isn't working. I don't have a choice. If they're not going to succeed in probation, what can I possibly do? And talking about a local buy-in is really important, because in Kane County right now, the probation officers are on strike. So judges are conducting bond call without the bond assessments that are completed by probation. Probationers don't have anybody to report to. Because apparently the local buy-in isn't what it should be. We have to have probation. If that means we have to have probation officers, and sadly that means we have to redirect some finances to pay for the criminal justice system. Because as I said at the beginning, the one role of government that we want is to make us safe, and if we want to make us safe, then we have to use all these all the alternatives of prison. We have to pay for it. But nobody wants to pay for it. And you talk about expensive. I was in court recently, high speeding ticket. At the end of the day, that person is going to pay roughly $700 on their high speeding ticket. I've had prosecutors, when I come to court with some of my, a student, and I say, you know, they're a student. And well, they've still got to pay the $500 fine. I said, you know, in colleges today, there are food pantries, and you want these students to pay $500? And sometimes there's just no talking.
So it's a little after 11:30. So I want to ask one more question, and then we'll have each of you answer as briefly as possible. But I think this is an important topic. So each one of you has mentioned the public, whether you've said that we as a society tend to be punitive or we've got public buy-in on certain reforms. I think some people think that the criminal justice system doesn't affect them. Or maybe they think that the people in prisons deserve a scarlet letter for the rest of their lives. But even if someone doesn't care about this system, why should everybody care about what happens to the criminal justice system in Illinois?
Well, since I'm first in line, I'll take this first. I think one very simple way is we all pay for it, right? We all are taxpayers, and there's $1.5 billion a year that goes to the state corrections, as well as many, many more millions that go to pay for state and local systems. So if for no other reason, we should care about it for dollars and cents. But I think it also goes back to your first question, why do we have this system? And I said, well, we want safety and we want a sense of justice. I think people, when they feel unsafe, when things happen like a carjacking in their neighborhood, they do, for better or worse, look to the criminal justice system or policymakers to create some response to that makes them feel safe. And then when somebody is, alleged to have done something that transgresses our societal values, we want to feel like justice has been done, that person has been, whatever that looks like to us, whether that's retribution or that's rehabilitation. We can conceive of justice in many different ways, as Derek pointed out. That's what we need to come back to. And so, while I collect my thoughts, I'll pass the microphone.
I think your sense of justice depends on which side of the coin you're on at any given time. If you're a victim, your idea of justice is, I want to be compensated for the loss. I want this person to pay for what I did. If you're the defendant, you hope that the justice is not so swift and not so sure, and that maybe they will look at you as a person. But all of us live someplace. All of us want to be safe. Some of us have children. We want them to go to school, and we want them to come home at the end of the day. Who'd have thought that had been something we hoped for, that they just get home safely from school because of what happened to school 10 years ago? But the world has changed. So we all have an interest in this because we all live here.
Exactly, and not only that, it's almost to a point of gospel right now when we talk about the 95% that come back. Well, they're not living out in the middle of the lake; they're living in their communities. And if we don't try to rehabilitate or we don't try to suppress any sort of criminogenic tendencies in one way, shape, or form. That is a direct public safety interest that bears on these particular communities. I can tell you why conservatives care about this. There was some archaic thinking on, well, this, if you do the crime, you should do the time, and nobody disagrees with that. It's the breakdown in between is where I think we're making a lot of progress in understanding. For example, if you look at certain offenses, and that's why Texas had the advantage of that, without having all those locked in mandatory minimums, you can discretionarily sentence people to the appropriate treatment process instead of having to send them to a facility that doesn't necessarily have that. And when you look at, I would say the most underlying thing of all is it has to do with the legitimacy and non-arbitrariness and non-capriciousness of the system. Conservatives have been railing against civil asset forfeiture since the abuses started cropping up in the late 90s and early 2000s. And people are like, oh, well, that's kind of odd because conservatives like the police and the benefits of the police. Yes, but what it does is it takes the legitimacy of the entire system and holds it hostage to this one unappropriated funding stream. And that's why you have some of, I would say, the most vociferous opponents of forfeiture at the federal level being like the Heritage Foundation. And nobody would argue that Attorney General Ed Meese is not pro-cop or soft on crime, but what he realizes is that this is something that fundamentally affects our constituted system, that we actually, in pursuit of this particular revenue stream, we are selling out the legitimacy of our system, and that's what needs to be changed.
Well, somebody took Junior's car.
I guess I would say, I agree with all this, but I would say, it's what we do is not a reflection of the best of who we are. And I mean that, there's a reason why the Founding Fathers in the Bill of Rights has several protections for the criminal process, because they understood that this is the most, potentially coercive and dangerous part of government. And I think, and even historically, I mean, it's true, everyone here knows, I'm sure, that we incarcerate more people in any other, or per capita and by number than any other country in the world. We use incarceration at a shocking level. And that's true when you compare it to what's going on right now, but it's true in our own history. We weren't always like this. So I think, I guess I reject the idea that people don't care. I think when that happens, we need to argue with them and say, this is, to get really patriotic, I think what's made this country great and what makes us a history of the world is that we're a country that's founded on various ideals. And one of them is that, a person's liberty is sacred and should be protected. And I think the system we have right now is very careless with that.
Well, gentlemen, I want to say thank you. We're going to turn it over to audience questions now. So Sherry and I'm not sure who else, we've got some microphones floating around.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Celia Colon. I'm actually from Chicago. I'm a passionate reentry advocate. I'm a fellow with Just Leadership USA, and I'm also a speaker, international author, and I'm one of the many thousands of faces of prison rape. 92% of women that are in prison get raped or sexually harassed. There's no anti-rape strategies. There's no trauma-informed care once it is, if it's actually addressed and took into somebody. There's no mental health, wellness, spiritual care, or trauma-informed care once somebody comes home. I heard you guys been speaking about all the barriers and the things that exist and the keys to helping people. But if we don't help them mentally cope and deal with the trauma that they have endured, there's women living in prison with more trauma than they ever endured in their life. And we also have to take in the fact that 90% of the women that are there were already victims of some kind of violent trauma. And this is something that is not addressed. And I've been home 17 years. I personally have been called to answer this call of trauma. I have my speaking ministry. I've been in the Cook County for 4 years serving divisions 3, 5, and 8, where I host mental health workshops and trauma-informed workshops because I know what it takes to rebuild. I was raped at the age of 18. I came home when I was almost 26. By that time, I received treatment to deal with what happened to me. who was I to tell? There's a 2-year statute of limitation to report a rape in Illinois, so there's never any justice for me. So the work that I do is my justice. And the PREA that exists, the Pre-Rape Elimination Act in Illinois, is a joke. Let's be really honest. The number is plastered all over the public prisons, because I know it's not mandated in the private prisons. This number goes out to Springfield, and then in Springfield, somebody sends it back to the prisons. Who's going to help you at that point? And there's nothing that's being done. And every time I come to a wonderful discussion where I hear all of these stories and all of these wonderful things that people want to do, this is the elephant that's in the closet that nobody wants to speak about. So I stand here as one, but I speak for thousands because I know that pain. I've been there, and no one's ever helped me. And that's why I'm passionate about what I do, because it's something that should be on this table. It's something that should be addressed. You just said that yourself, that publicly people don't like the rape issue. Well, how come publicly no one's talking about prison rape and helping us? How come publicly nobody is standing there to do anything? So how can someone rebuild when mentally they cannot cope with what was done to them? I want to know, how are you guys, the people in power, going to help people like me? I personally fund everything that I do. That's my question.
Yeah. First of all, I'm sorry for what happened to you, and I applaud you for your courage. You're absolutely right. I think people don't think about people who we send to prison as victims. More often than not, they are, and often pretty heavily victimized people, women in particular. This is just kind of national data, actually data that my agency, ICEJA, has done. I mean, so you referenced 90%. I mean, I think it'd be fair to assume 100%, I think, in most cases. And it's especially women coming to prison with severe sexual trauma, physical abuse, and often the prison experience, not surprisingly, can re-traumatize them, can re-victimize them in many ways, including prison rape and sexual assault. One thing, so my agency, we're a federal grant-making agency, so we've got a fund called the Crime Act Fund. It's a fund that can fund services for people who are incarcerated, who are victims, and that's something we're looking to do. I think the challenge is we've set these systems up to not be compassionate in that way. And I think, you're asking what we're doing, not nearly enough. But I think in terms of advocacy, and whether it's from IPI, ACLU, wherever, this is why conditions in prison matters. This is why I think prisons are, there's solid research on this. Prisons they produce violence, and I think the reality of prison, and I think you talk to really smart correctional people, the research will say this, I think people who work in prisons will tell us, if they're not watched closely, if there's not proper training, the kinds of unfortunate things that happen to you will happen. And they continue to happen.
And I think that also speaks to the fact that, I mean, John, you said earlier, and I don't want this point to go unheard, because we were just talking as we were mingling about, is that you're not going to heal anybody in a cage. And I mean, it's a much longer debate on, the existential need for prisons. I mean, we could talk, we could go almost down a de Tocqueville path on several items there. But regardless, and I think that everybody on this stage agrees, is that it is completely uncontroversial among here to say we use prisons far, far too much. Again, it was that national default that we had for 40, 50 years, and we're not getting any sort of bang for a buck. Now, that leads to these horrific cases. Now, unfortunately, though, I think that a bit of sobriety about this is probably warranted. As we collectively start weaning ourselves off the prison first mentality, I think things are going to get worse in the prison. It's the same example when we talk about like cost per day. Texas has really cheap cost per day to incarcerate people. You know why? Economies of scale. We have an awful lot of people in prison. And I'm not saying it to be flip, but I'm saying it's like we've looked at these chosen metrics and don't necessarily have the background to them. And so I think that even if we start incarcerating fewer people, and those people have more criminologically dense, have more aggregated risk factors, if we don't do that consciously, stories like yours are going to abound even more. And so that's why when we talk about, decarceration, a lot of folks will just say, well, I know Cut 50 is a one that actually puts out a number, and it's 50% of what? This is why we need to have this very in-depth conversation, so such horrors just don't happen or can be prevented the best they can.
In Milwaukee, which is a center that collected data, last year alone, 15 women committed suicide after coming home with rape, and they have collected data, and I can share that information. They try to ask me if I had data from Illinois, because I work heavily within the field, and I told them I did it. But I mean, this is just, we need to do something about it, and I'd be willing to help.
Hello. Good morning. Oh, I'm sorry. Good morning. My name is Lynn Franco. I'm the 8th Ward Committeeman Republican. And my question is this. I know we got a whole lot of people in prison, incarcerated. A lot of them need to be. What about lawyers who are immoral, unethical, arrogant, and who play a big role in the problems going on today? I mean, you can look at Washington, D.C. about that, about these unfettered lawyers kicking people's houses down, arresting them first and then looking for a crime. Okay, this is known as trickle-down crime as far as what I see in Chicago. A lot of these people in jail, most of them need to be in jail. They've done something wrong. You're saying you can't heal a person in a cage? Put a crooked lawyer in a cage. I bet he'll get healed.
I'm sorry you've had a bad experience with the criminal justice system. I have to be honest with you, I haven't seen any of the things you're talking about. I haven't seen a lawyer and if we did, I assure you that we would see that person got prosecuted. That's all we can ask for. Well, everybody has experience with me is always very happy. That's all I can talk about.
Actually, I will never let an opportunity to bag on lawyers go to waste. But I think what she speaks to is a very important point that I was alluding to her about the legitimacy of the system. And why it is this way, I do not know. I think we tend to have this fantasy that we all live in, that basically the law can solve our ills, that if we only wielded it better. And then the conservatives among, up here are like, yeah, well, that's like the most humanistic fallacy I think that we can have. And so you do see some issues about when, people's property is targeted. I mentioned earlier the fines and the fees. These are people that have done something wrong. These are people that do need to be punished by law. But we need to start thinking to ourselves, are we doing that in the way the most effective that will beget whatever sort of response it is that we want? Ideally less crime in aggregate, and maybe specific deterrence on this one particular individual. And the problem that I think we've all identified up here is nobody has even defined what that outcome should be or what it should look like. So, it's something that needs to happen sooner rather than later. And hopefully we'll, as a society, come to some sort of at least consensus on that.
I guess I'd just add that, I think, at least in my experience, what we have is, or what I've observed is less individual, what we call corrupt lawyers, as just everybody playing the role in what's ultimately a corrupt and dysfunctional system. And so, the prosecutor or who's insisting upon the payment of some fines and fees that are in place to just sustain the system before the person can have their record expunged is not doing it because they're trying to keep that person down. They're doing it because they think that's the role that they are supposed to be playing as a prosecutor. But we have everybody compartmentalized in those roles, and we don't work together as a system toward a common goal of safety or justice or some common conception of those things. So that's to me where the real corruption lies. Although I'm sure there are instances of individuals who fit that bill as well.
Hi. So I first just want to thank Ben for being the only person to address race this morning. I think that's really important. So early on, the first question you were asked was to address the goals and purpose of our prison system, which I think is somewhat different from what the criminal justice system accomplishes for our society. And I'm wondering if you could address that latter question, which I think is really foundational for considering possible reforms.
Wait, the question is like what it accomplishes right now?
Yeah, societally. So you all talked about how it's a broken system, how some of you said broken from the beginning, corrupt and dysfunctional, but it's still a huge system and you've got a lot of resources in it. So who is that serving and for what?
Go ahead.
Since we're picking on lawyers, let me the system is flawed. I don't think it's broken. What we ask the system to do, it does. It takes people into custody. It brings them before a judge. It provides them a lawyer. It provides them a prosecutor, and it processes those people through the system. The question is, what do you want that system to do? It's a flawed system. And it really, unless you answer the question, what do you want it to do, then you can't wonder what the answer is. Yeah, because we don't have an answer to that question.
I would add to that. I mean, I think I was someone I certainly have said before the criminal justice system is broken. I wouldn't say it like that anymore for lots of reasons. Not to say that doesn't need significant change, but I think if it's broken, it's because we wanted it to be this way on some level. We collectively, we've allowed it to be this way. I think the criminal justice system, in terms of the people in it, very operational-minded people. They do kind of what they're told. I think it would be a mistake to, well, of course, in any group of people, there's always a bad apple here and there, but these are mostly good people who are doing their very best to do really hard and difficult things. The problem is I think we've asked it to do really impossible stuff, you know, going from curing crime to treating drug abuse to being warriors. And so I think, you know, as a society, and again, I think that's our job. It's our job in a democracy to kind of lay out the vision for what we want the system to do. And we've, I think, very cowardly ignored that because we've been scared to ask those kinds of questions.
And which I think bears on that even is the fact that absent that consensus, we all project what, you know, this was brought up earlier, that we project what we want society to be and see criminal justice and the criminal justice system as a tool for getting that eventually. When asked what the criminal justice system should do without any additional qualifying criteria, I'd say as little as possible. I mean, mostly because this is the most direct, most coercive element of the state. And so for it to be some sort of, the best thing that it can do is, like I said, be the guarantor of justice, which we still have yet to define, and still have just kind of floating out there as this amorphous cloud. But the criminal justice system in and of itself, when it has been used to achieve, or has been used in the furtherance of a utopia view of society, has led to some of the worst human rights abuses in history. So I'd say keeping that in the box to the best that we can is actually probably the best state of affairs.
If I understood the question correctly, I'm not sure if you were asking what we think the criminal justice should do or what it's doing right now. Yeah, so I think to that question, I think one of the main things it does is it sucks people and resources out of certain communities, and it picks winners and losers, and so, you know, other communities, we take those people that we took out of one community and we put them in a prison in another community, and we make that other community, you know, what the disinvestment over here becomes the economic development plan in a downstate community where we build a prison, and we create a reliance upon that pipeline of jobs, which, you know, inevitably means incarcerated people in order to have those jobs. And so we've picked winners and losers. We've disinvested from one part of the state, invested in another part of the state in a way that's really a dead end ultimately. I mean, that's not a real economic development plan for those downstate communities that have prisons. And so as we reckon with mass incarceration and reducing the disinvestment and the taking people out of communities of color and urban communities, we also need to figure out what's the plan to address the, you know, because if we do this on the scale we need to do, that means closing prisons, closing down facilities, people who have jobs working in those facilities that won't have jobs. So we need to figure out how to reinvest in both places at the same time as we fix what I would call it a broken system, and we can get into why, but some of you may have seen our policy guide, and the title of it is Broken, and I think that's, so I won't walk away from that description.
I'm not going to suggest that it's not flawed. I don't think it's broken because it's doing exactly what we want it to do. The question is, what do we want it to do? I tend to think that your view of justice is like your view of pornography. Depending on where you sit, you'll know it when you see it.
Hi, I'm Sharon Gorell, and I work for the Illinois Realtors, and we do a lot of public policy advocacy work on a myriad of housing issues. But as it pertains to this, and Derek, if you can maybe expand, or any of the other panelists want to talk a little bit about the injunctive relief topic in terms as it relates to housing providers and landlords. One of the dilemmas or conundrums that we find ourselves in is, number one, we are huge advocates for fair housing and making sure that everyone has an opportunity to gain access to housing for one of the very reasons you were talking about, Derek, is that you need a home first before you get anywhere else, employment and education and all of that. And there was some language in the ACLU document that spoke very minimally on the topic of housing. But the problem that we find ourselves in is, we have some local municipalities that are wanting to include criminal background as a protected class for purposes of fair housing. And then, so there's a lot of debate you can have on what the definition of criminal background is. Because then the confusing side of it comes when you take a look at the housing assistance payments contract that is drafted by the Department of Housing and Urban Development and enforced by the public housing authorities. They basically say that if somebody commits a crime, and it could be gives discretion on the part of the landlord of, now you need to evict that person. So, or local municipalities that draft rental registration requirements and licensing requirements that have, puts the onus on the landlord now to be, they're quasi sheriff's deputies in terms of how they have to regulate and manage their buildings and now they need to evict too, with no support from the local municipality or the police department and all of that. So what would you suggest that maybe we can take a look at, and what should we be talking about advocating for that strikes a balance but is consistent across the board between federal, state, and local regulation on housing management as it relates to criminal behavior?
Well, I would certainly say that with the broadest brushstroke, decentralization in all things, and definitely having the most local control on those particular items. I know that's that's wishful thinking in many cases. So what we actually did in Texas, though, when it came to the indemnification, is we actually in our civil statutes really allowed for basically like a suit of negligence, simply for renting to somebody with a criminal record, and they committed a crime, or a subsequent crime, I should say. Now it could be something completely unrelated to what their original criminal act what actually was. So we actually created some relief in that. But you bring up a bigger issue about kind of the idea. Why do we weaponize criminal records? And I think we all will agree that we do that too much. What value does a criminal record have? And I want you to think about that abstractly. What value does a criminal record actually have? What does it tell you about a person? It tells you that at one time they committed an act that was deemed morally offensive to society. They were caught at one time doing that particular behavior. Now, is that a soft predictor of recidivism? Certain crimes more than others, but overall, not entirely. That's more of the manifestation of a deeper issue of the actual criminogenic risk factors. Some people, commit a crime of passion and they're perfectly upstanding citizens at that point and will be afterwards, but they did something that was so heinous that they're now going to do 30 years. So we all have this conceptualization of the criminal record, and we think that it's, past performance being indicative of future results. When in truth, if you actually look at kind of the sunset of the validity of the information, the predictive value drops off sharply after 2 years. After someone's, after 2 years, depending on the crime, their relative, I would say perspective of reoffending is no different than anybody else here in this room. It basically just melds into general society. And so I think that this is, we look at these criminal records and have them as this lifelong, Hillary used the term scarlet letter. It's a scarlet letter that doesn't mean anything. And we use it to make so many decisions because I think that we as a society conceptualize it as shorthand for someone's moral turpitude, or we see it as a proxy for their character or value as a human being. I think the sooner that we can get away from that, the better. But I also think that policies like the indemnification really show, this is not changing too much boots on the ground stuff. Maybe we're wrong-headed in thinking this.
I mean, my answer to that question is I don't know. I think it's the right question for you to ask, though, and I think that's where I really hope reform can go. Is I think the same thing happens around retail theft. I don't think it's in actually retailers' interest to have really punitive shoplifting laws, but I can understand why they rely on it because I don't think we haven't really thought creatively about what other ways are there to address this problem. So I would love to talk afterwards, but I think it's the right kind of question. And I think people in the industries that often kind of are up against the criminal justice system in the way that your industry is. I think it's important for you to have a voice there and help think creatively about how to make the system better in ways that, I think someone like me typically, and this is I think historically or how reform can sometimes work. Someone like me or a legislator who really knows nothing about what you do will pass a law fully intending to make things better, but can make things worse in all kinds of ways.
Well, we're past noon, so we're going to wrap up with one more question.
One more
Gotcha.
question, rapid response.
Yep.
And maybe our panelists can stick around for a little bit.
I'm going to try to make this sweet and short. No one mentioned police. And part of criminal justice reform is when we have bad officers putting stuff on people that's not just because they know if I put this resist arrest or I put this, he's going to go to jail. They know this, even if it's false. And then when a person go to jail, and then for the judge say, well, I want to go to trial because this police officer was wrong. Well, a trial date would be in 6 weeks. You have to wait in 26 in California for 6 weeks. Or you could plead guilty now and go home today. And you plead guilty, you go home, and you don't think nothing of it until you lose your job at Uber because they did a background check and you have a resistant arrest against some police officer. And you said it's 2 years? This happened in 2015. I applied this year. Same thing. So my thing is with police, until we go after them, not go after them because I did this 2015 and Laquan McDonald got shot on TV that same year. And if me and 12 of my buddies, if I shot someone 12 times and my buddies went to Burger King to erase the tape, all of us would have been in jail. To this day, not one police officer in jail. That's the problem because they don't respect us and I don't respect them. It's sad. Someone can break in my house, car, everything, I wouldn't even call them. And that's deep. And I pay for them. That's deep, but I wouldn't call them for anything because I don't trust any of them. Your response, how can you handle that? Oh, and I reached out to the ACLU in 2015, no response when I was on house arrest because my violation, I was violated badly. I could talk off about it, but that's just my thing. I really wish someone would mention about police because they're the biggest problem to this. Worse than the judge and everyone else there because people love their word like God.
I'd just like to clarify, when I said 2 years, the criminal record is persistent. That doesn't go away unless you have a state that allows for it. The 2 years is basically the horizon of predictive validity of a criminal record. But On the actual policing matter, I'd really like to defer to David on this, but I would say that, but I'd like to say that I think that there are inflection points of police work that develop a subculture, and I think that that has been both beneficial and as you mentioned, not beneficial too. And I think that some of the schism that we see with some of the communities that they're subject to, I think that, you know, reality or perception doesn't even matter because perception is reality. And so the situation that you illustrated, if for no other reason, the fact that the community's guardians are perceived as such is already a systemic foul.
To address Laquan McDonald, that's being prosecuted, as you know, by the State's Attorney of King County. And I actually know everybody on the prosecution team. I've been on opposite sides of the courtroom with them. I can assure you that they are doing everything they can to secure a conviction. I've seen the work. Whether or not they get a conviction, I can't tell you that. But I can tell you they are spending hundreds of hours trying to get a conviction and fighting for the victims in that cause, not just Laquan McDonald, everybody in that position, fighting as hard as they possibly can. That much I have seen, and I can assure you. As to the role of the police, when I started on the Aurora Police Department a very long time ago, my dearest friend and I started at the same time, an African-American gentleman who eventually became chief of police, the first African-American police chief in Aurora. Not soon enough to keep me there, but that's a different story. But I can promise you this, he, like many police bosses, if you will, if he had one of his police officers caught lying or cheating, he would fire them. And I've seen it, I saw him do it. So the reform is there. It's just a matter of the right chief, the right superintendent at the right time.
Okay, I think the, you know, first of all, I apologize that nobody got back to you in 2015. I don't know what that was all about, but I'm sorry. Police accountability is inextricably intertwined with criminal justice, the criminal justice system, and reform of that system, restoring police accountability and restoring or creating some kind of trust between the police and the communities that they police in. Because you know, on one hand, we know that communities are over-policed and that that people do suffer because of that. And on the other hand, we know that what you said about, you brought another issue into this about pretrial incarceration, that a person, once you're arrested, will could stay at 26th in California awaiting trial for a long period of time because we put way too many people in pretrial incarceration. So those two, over-policing and pretrial incarceration, are two things that operate in tandem in that case, and two things that both need to be reformed. But clearly, the people who don't feel safe in their communities, that would actually like the police to do more to protect them, as you said, won't call the police because they don't trust the police. And that's a real problem that we need to, and justifiably in many cases. I'm not saying that they shouldn't feel that way. In many cases, they have every reason to feel that way. So repairing that trust is a difficult and long-term project, but essential to the project of reforming the criminal justice system from something that's broken and that people don't feel like does justice for, or isn't for their communities, to something that everybody feels like does create justice and safety for all. If we don't correct policing, we'll never get there.
Well, we've reached the end of the panel. This is certainly not the end of the discussion, but I want to, on behalf of the Illinois Policy Institute, thank everybody for attending. I want to thank our panelists for a really great conversation. And I want to thank again our sponsors, the MacArthur Foundation, and we'll hopefully see you again soon at another event, but stick around if you want to for a little bit. And thanks again, everybody.